Hello everybody, how's it doing? How's it going? Welcome to another fan reading in r/slash Tales from the Creeps. Hope you all had a good 4th of July. I know I did, spent it with my best friend. Anyway, today we're looking at a horror story called The Dragon Slayer? The Dragon's Den? The Dragon's Room. Okay, The Dragon's Room. This is by Lucky Burger. They when I posted about the about how I narrate stories, they suggested that I just look on their profile and just pick a story. I've tried to message them, but their direct messages aren't open, so I just left comments below the story to tell them, hey, I'm reading your story. I'm going to give them full credit, the usual. So I have not looked into this story. I have no idea what it's about, but something called The Dragon's Room just kind of piqued my interest. So this is a psychological horror, so that is probably what led to my interest. This is an awful start. I am sorry. All the links will be in the description below if you want to check out the author. And that's all I have right now. So anyway, without further ado, The Dragon's Room. He heard the rumble of the engine before anything else. The November sun was casting a deep red-orange hue into the cigarette and beer-scented living room as the headlights from the beat-up old pickup pulled up into the cracked and overgrown driveway. Francis dropped the fantasy book he was reading and ran into his bedroom, barricading the door quickly and quietly, prayed that Marcus wasn't drunk again. That prayer was quickly abandoned when he heard the front door explode open and slam shut, making the shitty little house rattle with the fury of only a dragon could rival. "Frank, get your skinny ass down here now!" His father had been a violent, drunken monster since his mother left and the steel mill closed. The only thing keeping him going was the welfare checks his father got in the mail and spent at the bar every week. Marcus' voice boomed again. "Frank, so help me if you've been reading those devil books again, I'll beat your ass better than the Prince of Hell himself." The heavy footfalls of boots on stairs silenced any outside noise, leaving Francis with his own heartbeat and breathing to count the seconds he had before the handle to his room rattled in place, stopped only by a cheap desk chair. Boom. 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 The chair under the doorknob couldn't hold much more punishment. Each boom made the old wood sound like it would splinter at any minute. Francis thought for a moment of leaving out the window, trying to make it to the friend's house or maybe Meemaw's trailer on the other side of town. He had a bike. It could be so easy to leave. But the fallout from what would leave the man on the other side of the door furious and being reliant on welfare checks meant that Marcus could lie in wait, sitting in his chair, watching the door, smoke billowing from his nostrils. Cheap beer cans scattered around his feet, illuminated by the blue-white glow of the old TV, glaring like a beast ready to strike. The other factor preventing Francis from running was the police. The last time he ran, Marcus called them, claiming the boy ran away, and when he was brought home, they told Marcus to keep an eye on him. That memory was interrupted by a sudden crack. "Damn it, Frank, look at what you made me do!" Marcus had finally made it through the barricade, and his head swept through the room before locking on the small child sitting on the floor in front of him, bewildered. In an instant, smooth motion, Marcus had removed his belt and struck Francis as fast as a cobra. The thick red welts left by each strike stung less than the words Marcus bellowed at him. "This is why your mother left, Frank! What happened to your good morals?" When the man felt Francis had enough whipping, he dropped his belt and in fervor, tore down every poster and drawing of knights, dragons, elves, and dwarves and shredded them. He went to the small bookshelf and ripped pages and pages out of every book he saw. He finished his tyrannical destruction by going to the door, now hanging loose in its frame, and pulled it off the hinges. "I warned you not to block this damn door. Now you don't get one!" Marcus hefted the splintered remains of the door down the stairs and onto the front porch, haphazardly throwing the door into the dying yard. This wasn't the first time Francis had lost door privileges, but it was certainly one of the worst instances. This is rough. My gosh, just a straight gut punch. When Marcus returned, he seemed to have calmed down, if only for a moment, before seeing the pathetic look on his son's face, sparking a new hatred for the child. He had his mother's eyes, soft, doe-like, intelligent, reminded Marcus of the woman who left, and he struck Francis with a calloused fist, leaving the boy with a large black eye on the left side of his face. That's when something changed. Francis had taken a few open-handed swats before. Usually his father would leave a bruise on his arm or cheek, and he's been spanked with a belt more times than he can remember. But this was the first time he was ever truly hit by his father. Felt the broken skin on his father's knuckle, what he imagined scales felt like. He felt stars behind his eyes. Everything slowed down. Everything went hazy, and then nothing. When he came to, Francis realized two things. First, it was dark, and second, his father was sleeping in the next room. The rumble of his snore sounded monstrous, like some giant beast had moved in. Francis went to his cheap digital alarm clock and read the display, 12:07 a.m. Had he really been asleep that long? He looked down at the disaster around his feet, then looked under his mattress. At least his father didn't check his bed. His better hiding spots. There was a small flashlight and his last fantasy book, The King of the Dragon Slayers. Francis had read the book already, but after his father's rampage, it was all he had. He ducked under the thickest of his blankets, a thread-bar cotton sheet, and aimed his flashlight at the pages, filling his still throbbing head with stories of the kings and knights, trolls, dragons, and fairies. Francis drifted off at some point, and he woke to his alarm clock alerting him it was 7 in the morning. He hid the book and flashlight back under his mattress and got ready for school. As he went into the hall, he heard the snoring occasionally break with some incoherent mumbling drifting from the father's room. Francis didn't bother waking the beast, instead quietly sneaking down the stairs, grabbing a Pop-Tart, leaving through the kitchen door. As it made less noise than the heavy front door, the brisk morning air made all of his welts sting, and the blinding sunlight made his head swirl. It was funny, when he reopened his eyes, he could have sworn he saw a griffin soaring in the air. After blinking a few times and his eyes readjusted to the sky, he saw it was nothing more than a pigeon. Francis tried to wave off the strange occurrence as he went to the shack behind the house to retrieve his bike, but again, when he got to the shack, something didn't make sense. Did he hear a horse? Did his father kill him? Is he, like, hallucinating, or is he in, like, some after-death dream? That's depressing. Francis was confused at how a horse could have gotten into a locked shack behind the house, let alone in rest country. He quickly fumbled with the tumbler lock, entering the code 80085 and giggling to himself. Then pulled the metal doors. Oh my gosh, I just got that. Boobs. Metal doors opened, expecting to see a horse, but it was just his BMX. Looked around inside the shed, and when he found nothing, he chalked it up to be another strange prank his active imagination was playing on him. Francis pulled the bike into the dying lawn, relocked the shed, and rode to school. The ride was relatively normal. He passed by a few people's houses, past the liquor store and 24-hour gas station. Eventually making it to his middle school before his classes started. When he got inside the school, the halls were a mess of students chattering and getting ready for the first classes of the day, but Francis's mind had been acting up again. Could have sworn the older boys were greener and toothier than he remembered. He stared at the strange brutes longer than he thought and noticed almost immediately, "You got a staring problem, butt munch?" The bigger of the three asked, pushing to the center of Francis's view. When he didn't get an answer, he leaned in closer to the dumbfounded boy and asked another question. "Hey! You listening, runt? I asked you a question." Before Francis could think he was on his back and his stomach hurt, the bullies had turned back into their pimply selves and chuckled as they walked away, at some point having taken Francis's wallet and raided it whenever small bills he had saved for lunch. When he finally got back up, Francis was lost in anxious thoughts. Why did he keep seeing and hearing strange things? Was he going crazy? The loud and ear-splitting ring of the first bell put off the notion of going to the nurse's office. He couldn't be late again, or he'd get detention, and that would make Marcus worse. Francis hurried upstairs to his first class. Thankfully, social study was normal. His teacher looked like he was still a human, albeit wearing blue, star-covered robes. His classmates were all still normal. He made it through the class with relatively no issue aside from the splitting headache, and pixies and gnomes darting behind the backpack of cubby wall. Second period, however, had changed completely. His teacher had turned into a long-eared elf. His classmates were all manner of creatures from fantasy books, and when he went to the bathroom, he saw himself in the mirror for the first time that day. He looked like the king from the book he was reading. His black eye looked exactly like an eye patch the king had gotten when he lost his eye in the battle for the Shattered Peak Citadel. Francis smiled at the thought of being a king. He felt gallant and refined. At lunch, he joined his friends, and at the table, smiling widely as he saw each of his friends look like knights, all bearing the crest of the kingdom on their shoulders, a dragon with two swords crossed behind it. "Hark, knights! What brings you to this fine meeting of the Dragon Slayers?" Francis sat down without any food. His friends offered bits of their lunch to help him. When they noticed the black guy, they asked a myriad of questions. Most common were, "What happened?" and "Who hit you?" Only Samson had remained quiet, already having talked with Francis in fourth period. Francis didn't respond to their questions. Instead, he smiled, reassured his knights it was just a minor injury, and he'd recover enough to lead his knights into victory again soon. Then he asked them, "You guys still on for D&D tonight? Samson told me in fourth period he'd get a new wizard spell last session and wanted to use it tonight." "Hey, I wanted that to be a surprise!" The lunchtime revelries had put his friends at ease, and Francis went about the rest of the school day, only occasionally seeing the odd fantasy creature pop up. By the end of the day, Francis felt like he had gotten the hang of what he had been seeing. And when his friends met him on the bike rack, he wasn't even surprised to see his bike had suddenly turned into a pure white stallion in resplendent silver armor. Francis had the knights mounted up and headed to Sir Samson's castle, and barring the intrusion of the lord and lady who resided within the castle walls, the group feasted on pizza and wings and began their game of strategy. Francis had nearly lost track of time when he heard the phone ringing in the other room. The boys had just reached the gates of Asterion, and were caught up in a fight for their lives against the skeleton guards when they were interrupted by the lady of the castle. Samson's mom had answered, and after hearing the voice of the other end, she looked heartbroken. She knew what the call meant. Francis wished she would lie to the voice on the other end, that she would tell Francis that he could stay the night, anything to avoid what he was about to hear. "Francis, your father called. He said you had to head home immediately. He sounded upset that you didn't check in on before coming over here. Do you need a ride?" He knew that he had to go back at some point, but didn't like the prospect of returning so soon. When he left his friend for the night, he saw the dark road was illuminated by large torches along either side. Whoops, sorry, that's my phone. I needed a... My bad. Illuminated by large torches along either side, some barely flickering by as they died in the cold wind. Others held strong and guided Francis home with relative ease. As he brought his bike into the stable out back, he unlocked the door and put the BMX back in its place, then locked up again. He went inside the dragon's cave, where the smell of fire and brimstone was strong, fresh, and the dragon's horde clattered around the floor. "Where have you been, you little shit?" The voice erupted from the back of the living room, an orange glow barely visible against the bright light coming from the TV, and there sat the great red dragon. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" Francis was paralyzed with fear. He didn't know what time it was, but it had to be at least 7 in the evening. The rule was typically be home before the streetlights came on, but that was when Mom was around. Sometimes he would stay the week at Samson's or Travis's house, and his father would barely notice he was gone. Why did it matter so much to Marcus now? Francis's thoughts were cut off when he felt his father's gargantuan paw grip tightly around his skinny arm, and then the sudden burning as the cigarettes pressed down into his forearm. Francis didn't know what happened next. He just realized he was outside and his father was yelling. Francis ran, away from the dragon. The burns on his arm were still fresh, and the cold air felt good. The first few flakes of snow began to fall, ushering the early throes of winter's inevitable arrival. He didn't know how long he had to run. He didn't know where he was. Meemaw's trailer. Meemaw was an older woman, in her late 70s, and was more of a family friend to Francis's mother. Everyone in town knew her. She was the old lady who ran the diner until it burned down. Francis has only ever heard of her past through his mother. She would tell stories of her time as a young girl over tea, and the most important part still rang in Francis's mind as he nervously waited outside the trailer's warm yellow glow to see if she would grant him sanctuary. She was a child during women's suffrage. She was married to a Herbie in the 30s, and when World War II broke out, was a riveter building planes for her country. By her 50s, she had been a part of the civil rights movement. Her diner had become one of the few places that sat both black and white patrons, and a reason when questioning by the angry and comfortable townsfolk, their money is as good as yours. Francis saw the silhouette of the old woman who was busy making a TV dinner for her husband. Moved and locked its gaze on him, having noticed Francis shaking in the cold like a leaf, and brought him inside. Then she saw the burns. Meemaw ushered Francis into the cramped trailer and past Herbie, who stared at the boy with hollow eyes. Francis shuffled uncomfortably under the gaze of the man as if he tried to make himself as small as possible. Meemaw turned around and reassured Francis his bark is worse than his bite. And reassured Francis his bark is worse than his bite, before quickly pulling him into the tiny bathroom where she ran him under ran his arm underwater, lacing the ensuing blisters and applying generously amount of Neosporin, and covering his arm in a thick gauze bandage. When Francis relayed the events of the night to her, Meemaw looked confused, like he was speaking a different language. Meemaw, I fought a dragon. I couldn't let him hurt me any more than he already has, and since the former queen has fled the castle, the dragon's fury has only grown. Francis, are you okay? Try speaking slowly. I can't understand you. What do you mean you fought the dragon? Goodness, I haven't seen burns this bad since a factory manager got his tie stuck in the engine of a plane. Hold still, dear. This was only hurt a second. I mean that I said, Madam Apothecary. I fought valiantly against the dragon, earning these scars upon my arm. Thank you again for bandaging me, but I require the assistance of the royal guard to defeat the beast. I left my steed behind, sadly, but a sacrifice I made only out of self-preservation, and I intend to rescue the... What is that? The sound of wailing and flashing lights of red and blue face interrupted Francis's monologue as he looked through the window of the cramped hut and saw two trolls clambering out of their wagon. The imprisoned Fae, now silent but still flashing, the trolls knocked on the door, calling out, "Rust Country Sheriff's Department," prompting Meemaw to answer. "Yes, officer? Can I help you?" "Evening, Meemaw. We're here on behalf of Marcus S. Howard, looking for his son, Francis Howard. Apparently the young man ran away from home again, and we were just checking the place he's been known to frequent." "Well, officer, I don't know what happened, but I have..." "Don't let them take me!" Francis interrupted the conversation involuntarily, as if his mouth was not his own. "Okay, son, let's get you home." The troll grabbed the boy under his unbandaged arm. "Your father's very worried about you and said they weren't supposed to be out this late at night. Why did you come all the way out here all places?" Okay. Do the officers just not notice the signs of abuse all over this kid? Like, at all? Like, I get this is a kid. He's like replacing actual events with imagination because his mind just can't really comprehend it. It's really depressing. Hold on. Excuse me. Francis stayed silent. The tears in his eyes stung as he was brought back to the dragon on a silver platter. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know why the dragon even bothered keeping him around if he was such a burden. Francis was tired, and when he was at the mouth of the dragon's cave, he stopped. The door opened and the dragon stood there, a bite mark on his hand, and a fake look of concern on his face. Thanked the officer, dragged Francis back into the house, and closed the door. The dragon stared out the window, watching the trolls leave. Once he was certain that they were alone, he turned to Francis and whipped his tail at the boy, cracked viciously in the air next to Francis's head, and the dragon growled, "I don't know what the hell y'all were thinking, Frank, but I suggest you get your ass into your room this instant before I whip your backside so badly you can't sit down for a week!" Francis had rarely heard the dragon speak so quietly, and was genuinely terrified by the sheer hatred and malice he heard behind each word. Normally, the dragon would yell, berate, and strike the king with his tail, sometimes locking him in a cell until it's thinking the king learned a lesson. But this was the first time the dragon was quiet. When the cell door still sitting outside the cave, King Francis had very few options of escape that wouldn't immediately alert the dragon. He decided to lie in wait. If the dragon was being patient, he would be too. It was early in the morning, still dark out, and the King Francis had a plan. If the dragon wouldn't let the king leave willingly, the king would just have to slay the dragon. He crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the traps and loose treasure the beast left along the mossy floor. The smell of fire was dying down now, and the smoke clung to the ceiling in thick gray blankets, and soon the king heard the telltale sign of the beast sleeping. The rattle of the most recent addition to his hoard clattered into the ground, and then the snoring began. Francis crept into the sacred room where the dragon had kept weapons of former adversaries, pitchforks and shovels and swords covered in every surface. Covered in whatever the dragon last ate, in this case, spaghetti, but the king was looking for a specific relic. It sat on the counter, firmly lodged in the stone. Francis tested this kingly worthiness and gave the sword a gentle pull. When it didn't stop, he fully drew the sword in his hand. It was sharp, sharper than anything he'd ever held before. The king turned back to the dragon. He'd been burned, lost an eye, and whipped by the dragon's ferocious tail. He'd steeled himself and moved carefully so as to not disturb the dragon's hoard. He was right at the dragon's throne. His heart raced at 1,000 beats a second, then with a ferocious war cry, the king plunged the sword into the dragon's belly. The dragon roared a mighty, painful bellow. He looked down at the king in disbelief, but he didn't have any time to react as the king drew the sword back out and plunged it into the dragon again and 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 again. The screaming didn't stop until the sun came up. The king had finally silenced the dragon by plunging the sword into the neck of the beast. Only a soft, wet gurgling and the wheezing of a dying beast filled the cave. The sun cast a strange shadow through the opening in the side of the cave. Horizontal lines cut across the room. Drenched in blood of the dragon, his corpse lying in a heap in the center with a sword sticking out of its side, and Francis heard the wailing of the Fae. He saw the dance of blue and red Fae through the strange opening. He was free. He killed the dragon. The king opened the door to the cave, now safe from the dragon's terror, and stepped into the sunlight. That was really, really rough to read because it was clearly about a child being abused and like just using the stuff he learned from books to just kind of fill in the gaps of reality to like better fit his narrative, if that makes sense. 'Cause, man, that was rough. That was one of the more serious stories. Like, I'm still shocked that the police didn't see the signs of abuse and like the awful living conditions this kid was in. That, or they just didn't care, which is unfortunately what happens in these situations. It's just very sad, but this was very, very well written. I liked it a lot. Thank you, Lucky Burger, for letting me read your story. I really appreciate it. I hope you keep writing. Like I said before, all the links will be in the description below if you want to check out the author and my Discord to come chat and suggest stories to me. So, anyway, that's all I have for tonight. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. You all right. Night all.